Okay, I'm going to give you a bit of an overview about sine and cosine, and I'm going to base that off the unit circle. So the unit circle is a circle with radius 1. So I know that if I asked you for the coordinates at this point, they would be the point 1, 0. Similarly, if I asked you the coordinates here, you'd give me 0, 1. And similarly all the way around. Over here to the left, there would be the coordinates minus 1, 0, and down below 0, minus 1. Okay, so when we're talking about sine and cosine, basically, if you can imagine that there's a ray here and we rotate it through an angle theta, okay? And with that, you're used to seeing a point out in the plane. And the point normally is an xy coordinate. But once you move to trigonometry, that changes somewhat. So with this ray in the plane making an angle theta, I'm going to drop a perpendicular here. And I'm going to draw what looks like to be a right triangle. Okay, so you can see that white right triangle out in the coordinate plane in what we call the first quadrant. So I'm going to label that. So if we were to think about this in terms of x and y, I know that this would be what's called the x dimension. This would be the y dimension. This is our radius, also known as our hypotenuse, which is 1. So we know from the Pythagorean identity things like this: x squared plus y squared is equal to 1 squared. So we know that's always going to be true. So once we introduce trigonometry, what we learn is that in a unit circle, instead of calling this x, we refer to this as the cosine of theta. And instead of referring to this as y, we call this the sine of theta. So although we can write this point on the unit circle as xy, that point could also be written as the cosine of theta, because that represents x, and the sine of theta, because that represents y. Now, in terms of the different quadrants that were discussed, this is quadrant 1, this was quadrant 2, this is quadrant 3, and this is quadrant 4. Now we're pretty familiar with the first quadrant. That's where x is positive and y is positive. So oftentimes we'll write that as a plus and a plus coordinate pair. Now when we move to the second quadrant, that's where x is negative and y is positive. So in quadrant 2, the x is always negative, the y is positive. In quadrant 3, when we're talking about x and y, or sine and cosine, cosine and sine, I know both of them are negative, so this is a minus minus. So x or cosine is negative and y or sine is negative. And over here in the fourth quadrant, we know x is positive, so that means cosine is positive, and that the y is negative, or the sine is negative. So if you already understood what the signs in the different quadrants are or were, that translates directly to trigonometry, because if you can remember that cosine of theta is really x and the sine of theta is y, that'll take you a really long way. So now I'm going to go and look at your first question that you had for me. This says, oh, I've got it all written down. Hang on one sec. Okay, so your first question was, state the quadrant. Okay, I'm going to move the paper up, or move my camera. State the quadrant where the sine of theta is less than 0. So that means, so what they're kind of asking you is, where is the y less than 0? And where is the cosine of theta less than 0? So that's like saying, where is the x less than 0? So when y is less than 0, that's negative. And when the x is less than 0, that's negative. So where is the xy, or the cosine and sine both going to be negative. Well, if we go back up and look at our picture, I'm going to slide my camera up again. We know that that happens in the third quadrant. So the answer to the question is quadrant 3.